Thanks, Rob. So in addition to working for Oracle, Rob twisted my arm and got me to lead the Next Money chapter in Charlotte, North Carolina. So there's been a lot about, number 3 city and this and the globe and all this thing. So Charlotte's claim to fame is we're kind of the number 2 banking center in the U.S., according to the mayor of Charlotte. So what I'm here to talk to you guys about is really kind of the whole view around APIs, the API economy, what's happening, what does really Oracle offer in this space, how can you kind of use this to actually start to expand and kind of unlock the capabilities that a bank may have, and actually how can a FinTech go back and use that to actually go back and start to deliver some solutions. So to do that, what I'm going to do is first I start by looking at this whole API economy. I think the model for the API economy outside of financial services has really exploded. So we heard the stock twist guy talking about the millennials at his house consuming Netflix on any and every device that they have. I've got 3 of those at my house as well, do the exact same thing. And I think what you really see is that there are numerous players. There's a huge markets that can be grown by just exposing and consuming APIs. Just, example for me here, I arrived on Sunday night, jumped into an Uber. Uber's available everywhere, so it's really kind of the easiest way to get around. So this whole market of APIs is going to expand. So one of these I stole from you, Jim, so here's one of your slides. But I think what's the real opportunity? And so this is a few different studies that I was able to go back and find around what's happening around open APIs. So it's not just something that Oracle's seeing, it's really a lot of people in the market are starting to see this, that these open APIs are big drivers for the banks. They need to go back and start to push it, make them available, but really, what is it? How should I go back and open these up, and what should they really take a look like? If you look at APIs, and I think this is, I'm not going to go through a whole history of what the APIs look like, but early days, it really started out as kind of this overall, point-to-point sort of connections. If I put my hat on, I started kind of in this, in the late half of that 1980s around doing screen scraping technologies, this kind of brokering of applications, LU0, LU6, 6.2 around how do you go back and start to pull data across systems. And what we saw really in the 90s was that kind of opening up and kind of going down the model around middleware and starting to put these middleware applications together so that it was a little bit more structured around how do you went back and invoked APIs and accessed data. And if you really take a look at where these APIs are going now is from this internal world that says, how do I have all these internal applications? It's really, how do I go back and open up these applications so that I can either have a citizen developer, I can enable a third-party company to go back and actually start to access and go back and consume these APIs. And using certain technologies like REST. So APIs are, without a doubt, growing. It's a huge market, started in other industries. We're starting to really start to see these kind of go back and take off in financial services. The sessions that were here around the different cities and around the different areas where FinTech companies are coming up, it was interesting. It was all around financial services, payments, e-commerce. So those are really the big drivers. These are some statistics from the programmable web. So if you take a look at it, APIs, as it pertains to financial services, are big and taking off. So it's really a great place to get started. So what are some of the initiatives that are actually going on in the world? Most of these we're probably pretty familiar with. One is around out of the US. If you take a look at Capital One was one of these early banks in the US to start to go back and say, we're going to go back and start to expose some of our APIs out on the public net. Citibank's done kind of the same thing, which is going back and delivering a developer hub so that people can start to go back and consume these things. BBVA, another early adopter of APIs, looking at how they're going to go back and expose that out to different users. Then you start to take a look at more the kind of the FinTech startups or becoming a bank or delivering a banking platform. So Fedor has kind of gone down that path. And then if we look a little bit more, even in the Middle East, with the Emirates and DB starting to open up and make these APIs available. And lastly, what we're starting to see is really this whole regulatory authority that says we need to start to govern and think about how do we want to go back and manage these access to these to these public APIs. And we're starting to see some initiatives around that. So where do you get started? If you want to go back and leverage these APIs, what are the different areas where you can get started, start to go back and use these really across multiple segments? And so first is really around innovation. So if you take a look at innovation, for a bank to go back and start to expose their APIs, one is to go back and actually enable FinTechs to go back and consume them. So they can go back and start to access and leverage that capability. And so that can either be FinTechs, but it can also be other third-party developers. What we're starting to see, one of Oracle's large customers, Silicon Valley Bank and Silicon Valley, is even saying, hey, we're going to go back and enable our third-party customers to go back and consume our APIs directly, and even looking at going back and packaging those and delivering them in an app store kind of format. What you're also starting to see is really access to these chat bots. So this is one of the areas that we've been doing some POCs around, is really going back and exposing APIs so they can be consumed via chatbot, or going back and delivering not just an API, say, around a payments, but really looking at saying, how can you go back and deliver that around a whole lending? So I can go back and deliver lending as a white label process to go back and attack the market. So there's a whole movement around kind of innovation. The other areas around corporate access. So a lot of the people that we've heard talk at this conference is really focused on kind of around the retail examples. And I think one of the areas where we're starting to really see a lot of the APIs starting to take off, and part of this gets back into Oracle's experience around ERP and integration with ERPs, and so we have so many large corporates, is around helping the banks with the corporate onboarding and the ability to go back and expose those APIs so that you can speed up the whole process it takes to onboard a new corporate. Makes it a lot beneficial for the corporate as well as the bank, because then they're able to go back and start to charge their fees sooner, so you can go back and kind of shorten that whole cycle. And it really ties back into driving back a better around the overall integration with the ERP systems, and go back and drive a much better reconciliation process. If you look at the overall standards and efficiency, I think the main reason for a lot of these APIs, it was really quite interesting, the presentation that was here from Greece, kind of contrasting the different user experiences from, say, I think what it was Alpha Bank that had this great looking experience, and then contrasting it against some of the others, that it really wasn't driving that optimal experience. So this exposure of these APIs and allowing them to be constructed in many different types of applications, or just in different types of services, allows you to go back and start to deliver much better end experiences for your customers, because that's really important, whether that's an end customer from a retail perspective, or whether that's a corporate or an SME. The others around delivering kind of niche capabilities. So I think getting away from thinking I got to go back and deliver this full and complete application, how can I go back and just deliver some type of just a value-added service that maybe I wasn't offering before? Whether that's going back and saying, how do I go back and deliver a goal-setting module? Maybe I didn't have that before. The ability to go back and track goals, allow someone to go back and create that. The other key piece is APIs may not be just around a service, like give me a balance, let me go back and make a funds transfer, but it also gets back around how do you go back and look at digitizing that whole process. So whether that's the onboarding of a corporate, whether that's origination of the loan, you've got to really go back and look at how do you go through that full digitization of that process so you can go back and take cost out and start to really go back and deliver a much better experience. And then lastly is really the whole regulatory standards body. So we see all of this work around PSD2 and the specifications that are going to come out. We see in the UK around the open banking. There's lots of different country-specific implementations from their monetary authorities, whether that's the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Singapore Monetary Authority. You look in the US, which is where I am, and the state governments and the federal governments are fighting over who can issue charters to FinTechs and RegTechs. There's lots of different areas and use cases where you can go back and start to kind of leverage these capabilities. So if you go back and look at Oracle, what capability do we have to actually help the banks or the FinTechs to go back and get started in this space? And so if you look at where Oracle sits, Oracle does several things. One, we kind of start down at the lower level, which is around infrastructure as a service. So delivering a whole technology platform to go run this on the cloud. But then we also deliver a platform as a service, which has things around how do I go back and access security on a mobile device. How do we manage the system? How do we go back and access data? How do we have a API management platform that provides the governance and security around how do we go back and access those APIs? How do we allow them to go back and orchestrate a process? And then sitting on top of that is actually the financial services specific APIs. So as a part of our financial services global business unit, we've actually created a repository of APIs that it says instead of actually having to go back and define these things, especially if you look at PSD2 or open banking, they're going to drive the requirements around what those APIs need to be. It's really advantageous to go back and take that from a solution provider like Oracle versus delivering that if that's going to be a standard that everyone needs to go back and support. And then really on the top level is this whole concept around data and being able to access data as a service. And so this has been a new business, for one of the newer businesses for Oracle, where we've acquired a lot of companies that goes back and look at whether that's behavioral data, around social data, browsing data. So I can start to go back and start to leverage that data. So for example, we target that data to companies that are selling cars. So if someone's looking at a Mercedes-Benz, then BMW may be interested in that. They want to go back and try to target that individual. The other idea is the financial services companies can go back and leverage that. So it says when I visit my bank's website, instead of offering me a credit card, why not target me with an auto loan? Because clearly I'm in that the market for that kind of a product or good. And so the whole idea around leveraging the data, driving that around the APIs, to whether that's balance inquiries, onboarding, and then orchestrating that across the platform becomes quite powerful. So what are some of these APIs? So I'm not going to take you through the details. We'll ask you to come visit us down in the coffee break, and we're happy to take you through it all. We've kind of organized it around 16 different buckets, everything from customer onboarding, how do you do an origination, how do you go back and track it, how do you enable a payment, whether that's a person-to-person payments, inquiries, trade finance, wallets, all of these categories. And we've got about 600 plus processes today that we all document using YAML and can be explored in a repository using Swagger. And if we take a look, this just gives you kind of a view as to what does some of that, what are some of these APIs look like, what's the documentation around it. So instead of having to go back and think through and create these, we offer a huge accelerator for these banks to go back and say, hey, go back and start to consume these APIs, and I can actually go back and start to use them. So really use this as a kind of buy and build approach. Leverage these, integrate them into your systems of record, go back and use these as a FinTech to go back and get started, and it really will give you a huge leg up. So what we'd like to do kind of here in this last section is give you kind of an idea as to some examples. What do these things look like? Normally I do a demonstration, but this time, since I've got my hands full, I'm going to do some screen grabs of what these look like since I don't have a wireless mic. So I'm going to first introduce you to our customer. Our customer is Jenny Morris. Jenny Morris is 31-year-old, lives in Washington, D.C. She's married with a couple of kids. She's saving for a down payment for a new car, and she's also saving for her kids' education. And what we want to show is actually how is she using things like actionable data from third-party providers around what is she actually looking for? How can we use that to do better determination? We're going to go through multi-product origination. What does that start to look like? How do we go back and augment this with third-party data services from things like around travel and give her access to that information? So the first scenario is around Jenny buying a new car. And so as I talked a little bit earlier about if someone's actually out there browsing for a Mercedes or browsing for a BMW, that's data that can be made available to others to take a look at. So our customers here on the Kelley Blue Book site looking at cars, and as a part of doing that, you can actually drive offers and ads back down to that space. So the bank can go back and have an offer that says, hey, finance your car today with us. So if we actually click on that offer, it'll launch up our bank login. So Oracle's fictitious bank is ZigBank. So prior to logging in, what we actually see on the landing page, because we're pretty sure we know who this customer is, they've actually clicked on this offer. Or even if they hadn't clicked on this offer, we know based on their browsing history, we think this is Jenny. we think Jenny is a good candidate for a loan, we're going to go back and show that on the login page. And then once Jenny actually goes back and logs in, that whole offer will kind of expand through her, and we'll start to share with her a little bit more of some details. And again, the point is these are APIs that are underpinning this. So you can go back and add this capability. So we can see Jenny's established a savings goal of $20,000. She's almost hit it. We can see we're driving a competitive rate that kind of values her total relationship. We can see a calculation around what's it going to look like to go back and buy that loan. And then lastly, once she's gone through the application process, we'll go back and drive down that offer that says, hey, you've been pre-approved. So she has a conditional approval for her auto loan. And in our example here, the bank, Zig Bank, doesn't want to just make her an offer for $40,000. They'd actually like $55,000 worth of exposure to Jenny. So what they're going to do is they're going to cross-sell her a credit card. As a part of that, give her a checklist of things to go back and do. Some of it's gamification. I need to go back and complete the next task. Others get back to their things I actually need to go back and do, complete the documentation and sign off on the loan. So an interesting example around how can you go back and kind of stitch that through around what it looks like to buy a car. Another example is around goal setting. And I think one of the things we see around goal setting is this whole concept of I want to be able to go back and allow customers to document their goals and desires, track it, fund that goal. And so here in our example, what Jenny wants to do is she wants to save for a vacation. So she wants to take her family on a vacation to Paris. She can go back and establish an amount. We're going to go back and fund that goal, again, via accessing the APIs around payments and funds transfer to go back and move that money into her goal. And then we'll further allow her to go back and personalize that goal around what does she want to go do. She can upload her photo. And then what really gets interesting is the idea is when she's actually defined and tracked that goal, we're taking a look at that data, that same data that I talked about in the car example that says we know what her browsing history is. We're going through and saying we can go back and segment that data that says people like Jenny who are 31 years old or in their young 30s, they're married, they make $100,000 to $120,000 a year. They live in Washington, D.C. These are the types of things that they save for. So we can see people like her spend $15,000 when they go on vacation. These are the top 3 destinations. So all of this is coming out of the data cloud as we look at that from the context of who Jenny is. Also, where do they typically book? So this is also an opportunity for those same APIs. So don't just think that you need to start to expose APIs. You can also start to consume these APIs in the applications that you deliver, so you actually can start to stitch together some really interesting scenarios. And so this allows us to go back and look. She can book via Expedia, or she can book via TripAdvisor. Also, cross-selling other APIs around accessing different product types. So really kind of changing that whole mindset around what you're doing. The last example is around buying insurance. So for Jenny, she's bought a new house. It's been a few years since she actually bought that car and since she planned on that trip to Paris. And so now when she's actually accessing the bank is now realizing, hey, based on these different life change events, you really are ripe to go back and assess, is your insurance needs really meeting what you need to go back and deliver? So when Jenny logs back in, what we're going to do is drive back, hey, congratulations on that great new home. Let's go back and do a whole assessment around how healthy is your insurance needs. So this really allows us to go back and look at several different segments, whether that's health insurance, whether that's life insurance, whether that's property and casualty, travel insurance, all those allowing us to kind of walk through those different steps. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to actually capture those details so that we can actually go back and feed that out to a broker and start to get some results back that match her. So Jenny's going to drill into life insurance. We'll go back and start to capture some of her data, and I think what you're starting to see now, and we're starting to see around the health insurance, is the ability to go back and not do kind of this instant issue of a policy. So we'll go back and ask her, what's your overall health? Do you smoke? Do you not smoke? How much insurance do you already have? So she's really looking to top up her policy. We'll come back and say, based on your responses, we think, hey, you need about $450,000 worth of extra insurance. And lastly, what we'll do, as a part of that, we're going to come back and we're going to push that out and come back with a set of APIs from some different suppliers, whether that's Protective or Transamerica, to go back and actually offer that insurance to really meet her needs. So there we can see what her monthly premiums would be. She can just pick one, go back and actually fund it from her account, and she's off on her way. So I think what we wanted to kind of conclude on is really Oracle's vision for financial services. We think for APIs is don't just think about the regulation. It shouldn't be just around supporting PSD2, going back and supporting the payments. Really start to open up your mind around what this can be. How can you go back and expose more data across multiple different areas, whether that's the origination of a loan through a retail financing style capability, in addition to just doing those kind of payments things. So really start to expand what that can mean, because what it can also mean is extra revenue kind of opportunities for the bank. So the key here is really think about that. Innovation, not just regulation. The second is around when you start to go down the innovation path and not just the regulation path, it'll allow you to go back and start to look at some of these new revenue generating businesses. And so some of the areas where we're starting to even see this is we're working with telcos around financing of phones. And so what you're starting to see is some of these, the banks is looking at saying, how can I actually get my financing capability delivered out? And so deliver that out through a white labeled style capability so that I can actually go back and generate more revenue, but I'm not maybe the cost of acquisition to go back and do that customer, so it allows me to acquire that capability. And then lastly, it's bigger than just the front end. I think we think a lot of times around it's how do you go back and consume these APIs to deliver a better customer experience, but it's way more than just that. You really need to go back and look at how do you go back and deliver these to other suppliers? How do you go back and consume these to put together larger processes? So it's really quite important to think about how you stitch all these things together. And lastly, did someone take my, so I'll make the play here on the last one. I thought we had another slide in here. So we do have an area down in underneath the covered area where we actually have our API repository. We actually have the API cloud management tool. You can come down, actually take a look at some of these things in action, not just seeing the screenshots, and get a feel for actually how you can actually start to use some of these things, and we'd love to start to work with you. So with that, thanks, Rob.